The Castellane didn't serve men in wheelchairs, at least. That's what the maitre decided the moment the stranger rolled through its gilded doors. He came in quietly, a man somewhere in his late 30s in a frayed coat, 2 seasons out of style, his legs still beneath a thin blanket, a worn silver coin turning slow circles between his fingers. The woman on his arm, elegant, glittering, a diamond the size of a tooth on her hand, steered his chair toward the most expensive dining room in Chicago and smiled like a cat who'd already eaten the bird. Nobody in that golden room looked at him twice. He was just another broken thing the wealthy step over like weather, a man the city had clearly chewed up and spit out. Or so they all believed, because here's the thing the laughing crowd couldn't see. The man in the chair wasn't afraid. Not of the manager bearing down on him. Not of the phones lifting to film him. Not of anything in that room at all. While Delphine Kerr pointed one manicured finger at his chest and told him the charity line was around the corner, that the Castellane didn't seat cripples who couldn't afford the water, he simply tilted his head and started, counting faces, calm, patient. The way a man counts debts he fully intends to collect, and the woman wearing his ring just stood there and laughed, a soft, poisonous laugh, certain she'd finally won something she'd been hunting for a very long time. The coin went still in his hand, phones lifted. The whole room tittered at the cripple who didn't belong, and then, from across that sea of polished marble and cruel little smiles, a 26-year-old waitress named Adeline Bennett set down her tray. She was nobody, a girl drowning in her mother's hospital bills, working 2 jobs in shoes held together by tape, the kind of invisible the rich never bother to learn the name of. She had everything to lose and not a single reason to step forward. She stepped forward anyway. She crossed that floor, knelt to meet his eyes, picked up the coin he'd dropped, and pressed it back into his palm like it mattered, like he mattered. She thought she was defending a helpless man the world had forgotten. She had no idea who she'd just touched, what he truly was, or why a man like that would let an entire room believe he was something he wasn't. She only knew one act of kindness could cost her the last job she had. What it actually cost her, and what it would drag her into, was something nobody in that room could have imagined. If this opening pulled you in, do me a favor and smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who's ever been judged before they were known. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss the moment the truth finally comes out. Now let's go back to where it all began. 3 hours before the coin hit the floor. 3 hours before the coin touched the floor of Castellane Restaurant. The November sun had only just begun to rise over the red brick rooftops of Pilsen. A pale, weary light slipping through the torn curtain of the second-floor apartment, Adeline Bennett called home. She'd been awake since 5 o'clock in the morning, not because of an alarm, but because of the thick, rasping cough that had come through the phone when her mother called from her hospital room. Corley Bennett, 54 years old, was entering her 9th round of chemotherapy, and every call from her still began with the question of whether her daughter had eaten yet, as if she were the one who needed to be worried over. Addie sat curled on the edge of the bed, counting the bills spread across the kitchen table as though she were counting stones pressing down on her chest. One was from the hospital, carrying a number she didn't dare read aloud. One reminded her that the rent was already 8 days late. One came from the electric company, threatening to cut the power if payment wasn't made by the end of the week. She folded them all up and shoved them into a drawer, as if not seeing them might make the burden feel even a little lighter. In the bathroom mirror, she looked at her 26-year-old face, already marked by the tired shadows of someone twice her age, then tied back her hair, put on the white shirt that had faded to ivory after too many washings, and slipped into the black shoes with peeling heels, their cracked toes patched with a thin strip of black tape hidden beneath the hem of her pants. Those shoes were what shamed her most each time she stepped onto Castellane's gleaming marble floor. But she didn't have money for a new pair, and she told herself that as long as they still covered her feet, they could still be worn. Bryony Tate, her roommate and co-worker, was still buried in sleep after the night shift, so Addie left half a loaf of bread on the table with a small note reminding her to take her cold medicine, then quietly closed the door behind her. On the train into downtown, she rested her forehead against the cold window, watching the gray city of Chicago slide past, and inside her coat pocket, she squeezed the loose coins from the tips she'd earned during the previous day's lunch shift, money she should have kept for herself. But that morning, she'd pressed almost all of it into the hand of a trembling homeless man huddled by the station entrance, because she knew far too well what it felt like to have the whole world step over you as if you were a dirty puddle. When she arrived, the afternoon shift manager told her the restaurant needed extra help for the evening, an important reception with high-end guests, and they needed a server who knew how to stay silent, how to lower her head, how to become invisible. Addie accepted at once, not because she wanted to, but because an evening shift meant more tips, one more small payment toward her mother's bills, even though it also meant she would have to work under the watch of Delphine Kerr, the floor manager whose name alone was enough to make her stomach tighten. Delphine was the kind of woman who mistook kindness for weakness and poverty for sin, and she'd never missed a chance to remind Addie of her lowly place. Once, she'd thrown a napkin onto the floor and made her pick it up in front of guests because of a single crooked fold. Another time, she'd threatened to toss her out onto the street if a customer complained even once. Addie had learned to swallow those words, to lower her head, to smile, because she didn't have the privilege of wounded pride. She only had her mother, the bills, and an old belief her grandmother had once taught her, that a person's dignity wasn't measured by how much they had, but by how they treated someone who had nothing at all. She had no idea that only a few hours later, that very small belief would push her toward a man in a wheelchair in the middle of a room full of cruel smiles and change everything. While Adeline Bennett was clutching a few loose coins on the train into downtown, a few miles away, on the highest floor of a glass tower faced in black stone and looking down over the Chicago River, Beckett Greer stood motionless beside a floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city spread beneath his feet like a chessboard he'd been playing for 15 years without losing a single game. On paper, he was the chairman of Greer Holdings, a real estate corporation that owned skyscrapers, five-star hotels, and elegant restaurants scattered across the North Side, a name that appeared in business magazines with a courteous smile and numbers that knew how to please shareholders. But beneath that polished shell was another empire, a network no newspaper dared to print by name, where dirty money was washed through construction contracts, where debts were collected with fear instead of paperwork, where half the city's underworld slept or woke at the slight nod of his head. People called him the Ghost of Greer Holdings, not because he was ruthless, though he was indeed ruthless, but because very few had ever seen his face. Even his most loyal men knew him only through the low voice on the phone or through orders passed down by Hollis Frey, the head of security and one of the handful of people allowed to step into this room. At 37, Beckett had everything a man could long for, and not one single thing he'd ever truly wanted, which was someone he could trust without suspicion. Loneliness clung to him like a shadow, stubborn and silent, until he could no longer remember the last time anyone had touched his life without fear or calculation. In the pocket of his tailored suit jacket, he always carried one small object he'd never parted with, an old silver coin worn smooth by the rotations of his fingers over so many years. The face of the coin had faded until the number could no longer be read clearly, but he didn't need to read it, because it didn't belong to him. It had belonged to his late older brother, the only person in the world who had ever made him believe that blood was something that couldn't betray. Whenever he needed to keep his mind steady in the middle of decisions that could leave other people alive or dead, Beckett would roll that coin across his knuckles, and in the soft clicking of metal, he would hear his brother's voice rising from a past he had buried so deeply, he had almost convinced himself it didn't hurt him anymore. He told himself he had moved past it, that he had become cold enough for nothing to pierce him, that he had built walls around his heart as thick as the tower in which he stood, and most of the time, he truly believed it. That morning, Hollis came in without knocking, a privilege only he possessed, set a thin file on the desk, and said there was something Beckett needed to see at once. His voice was lower than usual, and Beckett turned away from the window, feeling something cold run down his spine, the kind of instinctive warning that 15 years in the shadows had taught him never to ignore. He picked up the coin, flipped it one final time between his fingers, then placed it on the glossy black wooden desk, and sat down across from the thing he didn't yet know would pull his entire empire, and a girl he had never met, into a storm with no way out. The file Hollis Frey laid on the desk was so thin it seemed almost harmless, but when Beckett Greer opened it and let his eyes move across the dense rows of printed numbers, he felt the air in the room grow heavy, as if the sky were holding its breath before a storm. It was a reconciliation of hidden accounts, streams of money whose existence was known only to a small handful of people inside his most trusted circle, moved through a chain of shell companies with meaningless names, and they should have matched down to the very last cent, but they didn't. Over the past 3 months, one small amount after another, shaved away with such careful precision that it was almost impossible to detect, had been leaking out, and the place where it ended made something in Beckett's gut go cold, because all of it flowed into a network he recognized at once. The network of Osgood Lane, the crime lord of the southwest side of the city, the man who had been craving Greer territory for years but had never been strong enough to face him head-on. Beckett sat still for a very long time, not saying a word, his finger tapping slowly against the tabletop in a steady rhythm. Hollis had learned to fear, because he knew the calmer his boss became, the more violent the storm underneath truly was. The problem wasn't the money. To Beckett, that amount was nothing. The problem was that these accounts had been buried so deeply that no outsider could have touched them, which meant the person feeding money to Osgood wasn't someone from outside. It was someone who sat at the same table with him, ate with him, laughed with him, someone wearing the face of loyalty while hiding a blade behind his back. He had built this entire empire on one iron rule, that betrayal was the only sin that could never be forgiven, and now it was taking root right inside his own house, from a hand he had once trusted. Hollis asked whether they should tighten the circle and interrogate each person one by one, but Beckett shook his head, because he understood that a clever traitor would smell suspicion before the trap could close, and if he became alert, he would burrow deeper, or worse, run straight into Osgood's arms, carrying every secret that could bring the whole empire down. He turned the pages one by one, committing every number to memory, and in his mind, the faces of those with access appeared in sequence. The aging accountants who had followed him since the beginning, the lawyers who knew too much, the trusted men closest to him, and even one person he didn't allow himself to think about for too long. The woman who was soon to become his wife, Priscilla Vane, the daughter of a family whose money was always clean on the outside and stained on the inside. He pushed the thought aside, not because he trusted her, but because he had learned that suspicion without proof was nothing more than emotion, and emotion was a luxury a man like him wasn't allowed to have. What he needed wasn't a name in his head, but evidence placed on the table, solid enough that no one could deny it, clear enough that when he made his move, no one in the underworld would dare question that the ghost's justice was absolute. He closed the file, picked up the silver coin, flipped it slowly once, and as the gray morning light reflected across the worn, smooth face of the metal, a plan began to take shape in his mind, cold and patient, a plan that would require him to become the very thing no one would ever expect. A weak man, a crippled man, a piece of prey that would make the vultures reveal themselves. The plan Beckett Greer built over the next 48 hours was so intricate that even those closest to him believed it completely, because the best hidden truth is always the one wrapped inside a lie, painful enough that no one thinks to question it. Late one night, the news began to spread through the underground channels he knew for certain the traitor was listening to. That the ghost of Greer Holdings had been caught in an ambush while leaving the harbor, that bullets had lodged in his spine, that the man who had once made the whole city hold its breath was now confined to a wheelchair, unable to walk, and along with his legs, had lost the very authority that had kept his empire standing for so long. Hollis Frey personally staged the scene, a few shell casings, a car smeared with blood, a private hospital where several doctors were paid to confirm something that wasn't true, and within a few days, the story of a fallen kingpin had become a whispering subject in every dark corner of Chicago's underworld. Only two people in the world knew the whole truth. One was Hollis, who had followed Beckett long enough to understand that loyalty sometimes meant silently watching the whole world misunderstand your master. The other was Wendell Pruitt, the loyal, elderly butler and trusted advisor, who had once held Beckett in his arms when he was still a child, the only person allowed to call him by his real name, without fear attached to it. Wendell didn't approve of the plan. He worried that pretending to be weak for too long would make the vultures bolder than Beckett had calculated. But he understood Beckett. Understood that once the man had made up his mind, no advice could move him. So he only squeezed his shoulder lightly and told him to be careful of the very people sitting closest to him. And sure enough, the first reaction came from the place Beckett had both hoped for and feared. Because only 3 days after the news spread, Priscilla Vane appeared at his apartment with a sweetness so carefully tender it was almost perfect. She knelt beside his wheelchair, took his hand, and whispered comforting words about how she would always stay by his side no matter what happened, that her love didn't depend on whether he could still stand or not. Beckett let her perform, his face wearing a flawless mask of weary resignation, but beneath that skin, his eyes were still counting, still memorizing every passing expression, every instant when her gaze flashed with something that wasn't compassion but calculation, every time she gently hinted at who would run the business in his place if his health no longer allowed it. Then, with a smile she believed was gentle, Priscilla suggested taking him out, saying he shouldn't shut himself inside four walls, that she had reserved a table at the most elegant restaurant in the city, a place called Castellane, so the two of them could have an ordinary evening like any other couple, so he could see that life wasn't over. Beckett looked at her for a long time, knowing full well that nothing about this woman was ordinary or harmless, knowing that the sweet invitation was another move in her own game, and he nodded, because he too was playing a game of his own, and a wolf that wants to know which one in the pack is baring its fangs must let them believe it no longer has teeth. He had no idea that the place she was about to take him, among people who would laugh and look down on him, held a girl with shoes patched in black tape, someone who was about to step into his life in a way none of his cold plans could ever have foreseen. When the silver coin rolled across the marble floor, and the whole room laughed at the man in the wheelchair, Adeline Bennett knelt down to pick it up. And now, in the middle of that sea of contemptuous eyes, she didn't stand and walk away as a wise server should have done. She stayed, placed the coin in his palm, then gently turned the wheelchair away from the reach of the raised phones, and pushed him toward a small table by the window, where no one was staring anymore. Her hands trembled, not because of the weight of the chair, but because she knew exactly what this act might cost her. Yet she still poured him a glass of water from the pitcher on the table, set it down before him with both hands as though it were the most precious thing she could offer, then lowered her head and said softly that she was sorry. Sorry on behalf of everyone in that room. Sorry that he'd had to hear words no human being deserved to hear. She didn't know who the man sitting before her was. She only saw a man the whole world had stepped over. And in that moment, she saw her own mother, saw the homeless man by the station entrance, saw every invisible person whose dignity had been treated by others as something too small to matter. Beckett Greer, who had been sitting motionless, counting every face with the coldness of a man accustomed to collecting debts, he suddenly felt something crack very quietly beneath the armor he'd spent 15 years forging, because in all that time, no one had ever treated him with kindness without knowing who he was, without fearing him, without wanting something from him, simply kind because she believed a human being deserved kindness. He looked at her hands, looked at the strip of black tape, barely visible at the toe of her shoe, as she bent down, looked at the poverty written plainly into every detail of her, and he understood that she had just traded something she didn't have to spare in order to protect a stranger. And that was what left him, a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched, utterly still. But the moment didn't last, because the sharp sound of high heels striking the marble announced Delphine Kerr storming toward them, her face twisted with rage at the sight of an employee daring to defy her openly in a crowded room. And without a warning, without a question, she pointed straight at Addie's face and declared on the spot that she was fired, that she should take off her apron and get out of this restaurant before she called security, that people like her would never deserve to set foot in a place like Castellane. The entire room fell silent, and Addie stood there, her eyes burning with tears that her pride wouldn't allow to fall. She untied the apron with trembling hands, folded it neatly, and laid it over the back of a chair, and in that instant she thought of her mother's bill, of the overdue rent, of everything she had just lost because of a glass of water and an apology, but still she lifted her head, because she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. When she turned to leave, a low, calm voice sounded behind her, the voice of the man in the wheelchair, and he held out a plain white business card, with no name, no title, only a string of numbers, then said quietly that if there ever came a day when she needed a job, she should call that number. Addie hesitated before taking the card, unable to understand why a man who had just been humiliated so terribly could say such a thing, with that much certainty. Then she closed her fingers around it, nodded her thanks, and stepped out of Castellane into the freezing Chicago night, never knowing that the white card she had just received was the doorway into a world she had never been able to imagine. The night train carrying Adeline Bennett back to Pilsen was almost empty, and she sat curled in the corner of the car, the plain white business card clenched so tightly in her palm that its paper edge pressed a red mark into her skin, watching the city lights blur past through the tears that now, with no one left to see her, she finally allowed to fall. She didn't cry because she had been humiliated. She was used to being looked down on by the world. She cried because of the very real fear tightening around her chest, the fear of the hospital bill she would have nothing to pay with, of the rent already overdue, of the fact that she had just thrown away with her own hands the only job keeping her and her mother above water. When she pushed open the door of the second-floor apartment, Bryony Tate was still awake, curled on the old sofa with a cold cup of tea, And one look at Addie's face was enough for her friend to know something had gone terribly wrong. Addie told her everything in a broken voice. Told her about the man in the wheelchair, about the laughter, about Delphine Kerr and the finger pointed straight at her face, about the moment she took off her apron, in the middle of a room full of people, and Bryony listened with wide eyes, hurting for her and worrying over her at the same time, then blurted out that Addie had been so reckless, that she should have just lowered her head and walked past like everyone else. Addie stayed silent for a long time, then said softly that she couldn't, that if she had stepped over that man, she wouldn't have been herself anymore, that her grandmother had once taught her a person's dignity wasn't measured by how much they had, but by how they treated someone who had nothing, and if she sold that away just to keep a job, then there wouldn't be anything left in her worth keeping. Bryony didn't argue anymore. She only sat down beside her friend, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and the two girls sat together in silence inside the small room, where the electric meter was still running, and the bills still lay in the drawer like wordless threats. Later that night, after Bryony had fallen asleep, Addie sat alone at the kitchen table beneath the dull yellow light, placed the white business card on the tabletop, and looked at it for a long time, turning it over and over between her fingers. It didn't look like any business card she had ever seen. There was no company name, no title, no address, only a string of numbers embossed on thick, smooth paper that she knew had to be expensive. And that mysterious emptiness made her both curious and uneasy. She wondered who that man was, why someone who had just been laughed at by an entire room could hand her this card with such chilling certainty, why the way he looked at her had carried none of the weak gratitude of a victim, but something deeper, calmer, almost like the assessment of a man who was seeing straight through her. She thought about tearing the card up, throwing it into the trash along with the ugliness of that night, because everything about it made her feel as though she were standing at the edge of something far larger than she could understand. But she didn't do it. She looked toward the stack of bills inside the half-open drawer, thought of her mother's pale face in the hospital room, of the thick, rasping cough that came through the phone every morning, and at last she folded the card with great care, tucked it into the inner pocket of her thin wallet, and told herself that she wouldn't call, that she was only keeping it in case desperation came. Though deep inside, in some vague and inexplicable way, she already sensed that the white card wouldn't leave her alone, and that her life had just turned down a road she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Castellane opened its doors as usual. The spotless white tablecloths pressed smooth, the fresh flowers replaced, and Delphine Kerr, standing at the host, stand with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had taught the whole world the night before who truly owned this space. But at 10 o'clock, a group of men in dark suits walked in, led by an attorney carrying a leather briefcase, and they requested to meet the entire management team at once, their tone polite but leaving no room for refusal. Delphine hadn't even had time to understand what was happening when the glass door opened again. And this time the person who entered froze the breath in her throat, because it was the very man in the wheelchair from the night before, still seated in that chair, still wearing that same coat, yet something entirely different radiated from him now, a cold and absolute authority that filled the whole room before he ever said a word. Beside him stood Hollis Frey and the attorney, and it was the attorney who placed a file on the counter, opened it to the first page, and announced in an even voice that Castellane Restaurant, along with the building in which it stood, had belonged for many years to Greer Holdings, and that the man sitting before them was Beckett Greer, the chairman of the corporation, the true owner of every slab of marble, every chandelier, every paycheck Delphine Kerr had received over all those years. The blood drained from Delphine's face, her lips moving without sound, and for a few seconds she tried to salvage herself with a twisted smile, stammering that there must have been some misunderstanding, that she hadn't known, that if she had known, she would never have. But Beckett didn't let her finish. He didn't shout, didn't slam his hand on the counter, didn't raise his voice once. He simply rolled his chair closer to the stand, looked up at her with eyes so calm they were chilling, and said he had sat still the night before and counted every face in that room, that he remembered every word she'd spoken, every finger she'd pointed, and that what concerned him wasn't that she had humiliated a man in a wheelchair, but that she had done it with pleasure, because she believed he was weak and harmless. He said a restaurant bearing the Greer name had no place for people who measured human worth by the clothes someone wore or the chair someone sat in, and that from this moment on, she was no longer employed here. Her contract was terminated. There would be no letter of recommendation, and not one restaurant in his network across the city would ever open its doors to her again. Delphine burst into tears, begging, speaking of her own bills, but Beckett only reminded her quietly that the night before, someone else had stood before her with bills of her own, and Delphine hadn't been moved in the slightest. In the middle of it all, the door opened again, and Priscilla Vane walked in. She had just heard vague whispers that something was happening at the restaurant, and had hurried over. But when she saw Beckett sitting there inside the circle of his own power, saw the shell of the weak, crippled man she had believed in vanish without a trace, her face went pale and stunned, because in that instant she understood that the evening she had arranged to humiliate him, to prove he was finished, had been turned inside out by Beckett himself, into a performance in which she'd never even known what role she was playing. Beckett's gaze met hers, not angry, not accusing, only the long, cold look of a man who had begun to see through her, and Priscilla, for the first time in a very long while, felt real fear creep down her spine. That night, in the office on the upper floor of the glass tower, Hollis Frey spread across the desk in front of Beckett everything he had uncovered in only one day, and the picture that emerged wasn't as simple as an arrogant manager punishing a poor server. Delphine Kerr's personnel file showed that she had been hired at Castellane 3 years earlier, not through the usual hiring process, but through a direct recommendation from the Vane family's office, and since then, every month, besides her official salary, a small stream of money had been flowing regularly into a secondary account of hers from a shell company that Hollis had traced backward until it all led to one name, Priscilla Vane. Beckett sat in silence, his fingers slowly rolling the silver coin as each cold piece settled into place inside his mind, because now he understood that the humiliation the night before hadn't been the outburst of an arrogant person, but a move calculated in advance, one link in a much larger conspiracy. Priscilla hadn't merely brought him to Castellane by chance. She had chosen the exact place where her own person held power, and she had instructed Delphine beforehand to treat him like garbage, to humiliate him publicly, in the middle of the city's powerful crowd, to plant in the minds of every witness the idea that the ghost of Greer Holdings truly was crippled, truly finished, an old lion without claws left, someone anyone could step over. It was a psychological campaign, a way to erode the invisible authority that had kept his empire standing. Because in the underworld, power was built on fear, and once that fear was replaced by contemptuous laughter, knives would begin sliding from their sheaths. Hollis added that the videos the crowd had taken that night had been quietly distributed by someone into the exact underground channels Beckett's rivals were watching, and that coincidence couldn't be accidental. It was part of the plan, a message being sent that Greer territory could now be torn apart. Beckett closed his eyes for a moment, and what chilled him wasn't the betrayal. He had lived long enough to know betrayal was the nature of this world. It was the patience of it, the way Priscilla had planted a pawn inside Castellane 3 years earlier, long before there had been any sign of the account leaks, which meant her game had already been laid out before he had even realized he was sitting down at the table. That also meant the person feeding money to Osgood Lane, and the woman soon to become his wife, were very likely part of the same network, 2 branches of the same conspiracy meant to choke him from both the inside and the outside. But Beckett didn't allow anger to control him. He understood that now he had seen the shape of the beast stalking him, and his greatest advantage was that the enemy still believed he was prey. He told Hollis to keep digging, not to touch Delphine yet, not to let Priscilla catch even the faintest scent that he knew, and then his gaze came to rest on the second white business card still lying on the desk, a copy of the one he had given the poor girl the night before, the only person in that room who hadn't belonged to anyone's calculations. And for the first time, he wondered whether, in a world full of planted pawns, selfless kindness might truly be something that existed. 3 days later, when Adeline Bennett had almost convinced herself that the white business card was only the leftover trace of a strange night, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and the voice of an older man, courteous and unexpectedly warm, introduced himself as Wendell Pruitt. He said he was calling on behalf of the man who had given her the card, and that there was a job offer he hoped she would consider. Addie hesitated for a very long time, but the image of the stack of bills and her mother's pale face pushed her forward, and so she found herself sitting inside a luxurious car, sent to take her to a glass tower she had only ever looked up at from the sidewalk, then being led to a floor so high that all of Chicago spread beneath her feet like a small map. Beckett Greer was waiting for her there, this time with no wheelchair, no old coat, but seated behind a glossy black wooden desk in a perfectly tailored suit. And it took Addie a moment to realize that the coldly powerful man before her was the same man she had poured water for that night. That truth left her both stunned and suddenly aware of why his eyes had never looked like the eyes of a victim. He didn't circle around the matter. He said plainly that he knew she had lost her job because she had protected him, that he wanted to give her a new position, a job with a salary many times higher than anything Castellane had ever paid her, and when she stammered and asked why he would do that for a stranger, Beckett fell silent for a moment, then spoke a truth he himself wasn't entirely comfortable admitting, that in his entire world, a world where every smile hid a calculation and every hand extended expected something in return, she was the only person who had treated him with kindness when she believed he had nothing to offer. And a person like that was so rare he couldn't allow her to slip away. Addie felt the cold honesty in his words, and she also felt something frightening hidden beneath it, because everything around this man, from the silence of the men who attended him, to the way the whole room seemed to hold its breath whenever he spoke, whispered to her that he wasn't an ordinary businessman, that his power had roots in dark places she didn't dare imagine. She wavered, and one part of her wanted to stand up and leave, to return to the familiar and safe poverty she knew. But another part, the part carrying her mother's life on its shoulders, made her nod, and in that very moment, she knew she had just crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. In the days that followed, working close to Beckett, Addie slowly began to see the contradictions in him that she couldn't fit neatly into any pattern. He was a man who could give an order in a voice cold as ice and make broad-shouldered men go pale. But he was also someone who would stop silently by the window for a long time each afternoon, as if carrying a loneliness too heavy for words to name. She saw him turn an old silver coin over and over in the moments when he thought no one was watching. And once, by accident, she caught his face softening briefly as he looked at it, a tenderness quickly hidden away, and those moments were what made her heart stir in a way that frightened her. As for Beckett, he told himself he was keeping her close, only because she was the one clean piece in his treacherous game. A person who belonged to no side, who couldn't be bought because she didn't even know the war was happening. But every time she entered the room with her clumsy sincerity and eyes that didn't know enough to fear who he was, he felt the wall he had built around his heart crack a little more, and that, more than the traitors waiting out there in the dark, was what truly unsettled him. As a professional habit carved into his bones, Beckett asked Hollis to build a complete file on Adeline Bennett, not because he suspected her, but because in his world, no one was allowed to come that close without being examined all the way down to the roots. And it was that very file, placed on his desk a few days later, that left him sitting motionless for a long time before a name he hadn't expected to see again. Addie's father, Thomas Bennett, had died when she was only 12 years old, and most of the file was nothing more than the quiet working life of an electrician who had taken jobs on construction sites around the North Side. But one detail made Beckett's heart stop for a beat. Because one of those projects, many years earlier, had belonged to the early period when the Greer Empire was still young and fragile, at the very time when Beckett's older brother was still alive and building everything from nothing. Hollis dug deeper at his command, and the truth slowly came to light that Thomas Bennett, on a night when he should have been nothing more than a nameless worker leaving late from his shift, had accidentally witnessed an arrangement that could have destroyed the entire Greer enterprise while it was still taking shape. And instead of selling that information to the highest bidder as almost anyone in his position would have done, that poor electrician had kept silent, had quietly turned away and carried the secret with him, simply because he believed betraying another person's trust was something a decent human being must never do. Beckett's brother had known, and had silently remembered that debt of grace. He had quietly helped the Bennett family through several hard times, without Thomas himself ever knowing where the help had come from, until Thomas died and that thread of connection broke, sinking into oblivion along with the death of Beckett's own brother. Beckett sat for a long time with the file open on the desk, the silver coin lying still in his hand, and a strange feeling rose in his chest, the kind of feeling a man far too accustomed to cold calculation almost failed to recognize, a stirring before something larger than coincidence. The girl who had knelt to pick up his coin, who had poured water for him, who had traded away her own livelihood to protect a stranger, was the daughter of the man who, years ago, had kept faith with his family when no one had forced him to do so, and that kindness, it turned out, wasn't something Addie had stumbled into by chance. It was something she had inherited, a bloodline of integrity flowing through 2 generations. And somehow, Among the millions of people in this city, it had led her back into the orbit of the Greer family. Beckett understood that if he told anyone else this, they would call it fate. And he, a man who had never believed in anything that couldn't be weighed or measured, found himself unable to deny it. It also explained why, from the very first moment, he had sensed something different in her. A truthfulness his world had killed long ago, and now he understood that the trust he felt for her wasn't recklessness, but the continuation of a debt that had never been repaid. Yet along with that warmth came a new fear, because he knew all too well that anyone who stepped into his world became a target. And if his enemies discovered how much she meant to him, then the very kindness that had begun to save him might be the thing that drove her toward death. One weekend afternoon, Adeline Bennett went to the hospital to visit her mother with her heart already braced for the familiar tense conversation with the billing office, where every time she walked in, she had to lower her head and ask for just a few more days to delay payment. But this time, the employee behind the counter looked at the screen, then lifted her eyes with polite confusion and said that all of Coralie Bennett's treatment costs had been paid in full, not only the outstanding balances, but also the upcoming rounds of chemotherapy, all of it covered by an anonymous third party. Addie stood frozen in the hospital hallway, the confirmation paper trembling in her hand, and for a moment she thought she must have heard wrong, because the number that had stolen her sleep for months, the number that had pressed down on her chest like a stone, had suddenly vanished as if it had never existed at all. The first surge of joy rising inside her quickly gave way to a cold instinct, because she knew there were no free miracles in this world, and there was only one person who both knew about her circumstances and had the power to do something like this without blinking. She didn't go home. She went straight to the glass tower, and when she stepped into Beckett Greer's office, she was no longer the timid server who lowered her head. She placed the confirmation paper on his desk and asked him directly whether he had done this. Beckett didn't deny it. He only looked up at her with calm eyes and said yes, he had, and that she didn't need to feel indebted for anything. But Addie's reaction wasn't the gratitude he had perhaps expected. It was an emotional upheaval that startled even her, because tears spilled from her eyes at the same time as a vague anger rose in her chest, and she asked him why he had done it without saying a word to her, why he had made a decision for her about something so important in her life. She said she had spent her whole life getting used to carrying everything herself, that the small dignity she had left rested in the fact that she didn't owe anyone anything, and now this enormous gift, even if it had saved her mother's life, made her feel as if she had been bound to a world she didn't understand and couldn't control. Beckett listened in silence, and for the first time in many years, he didn't know how to answer, because he was used to money buying loyalty, buying silence, buying smiles, but standing before him was someone for whom the greatest gift he could give had wounded her instead of making her grateful, and that both unsettled him and made him respect her more. He said quietly that he hadn't done this to bind her to him, that he didn't need anything from her at all, that if she wanted to leave tomorrow, the money would still be hers, with no conditions attached, and that he had done it simply because it had been a very long time since he had met someone who deserved to be helped without calculation. There was one truth he didn't say aloud, that this was also his quiet way of repaying the debt of grace his family had owed her father for so many years, a thread she knew nothing about, but he kept it inside, because he didn't want his kindness to be reduced to an obligation. Addie stood there, torn between a gratitude so deep it nearly choked her, and the growing fear that she was moving deeper into the orbit of a man whose power could erase a mountain of debt with a single phone call, and she realized, with a silent alarm, that what frightened her most wasn't his dark world, but the fact that she was beginning to care about the man behind that power more than she dared to admit. That night, rain veiled all of Chicago, and Addie stayed late at the office longer than usual to finish the stack of paperwork, so she was the only one still there when she found Beckett standing alone beside the glass window, turning the silver coin through his fingers in the slow rhythm she now understood as the sign of the moments when he sank deepest into the past. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it down beside him without saying anything, simply standing there, and perhaps it was that silence, asking nothing from him, that made him allow the wall to open for the first time. He asked her whether she knew why he always kept that coin. Then, without waiting for her answer, he told her it had once belonged to his older brother, the man who had built with his own hands everything Beckett now possessed, the man who had raised him after their parents died, the man who had taught him that in this world, the only thing worth trusting was blood. His voice was steady, but Addie could hear beneath it a wound that had never healed, as he said that many years earlier, the whole city had believed his brother died in an accident, a car plunging into the river at night. And for a long time, Beckett himself had believed it too, had held that pain the way a person holds a loss delivered by fate. But then he discovered the truth, piece by piece, that it hadn't been an accident, that someone had tampered with the brakes, and the person who had done it wasn't an enemy from outside, but someone who had sat at the same table with his brother, someone trusted, a right-hand man who had smiled and raised a glass only a few hours before striking, all because he wanted to swallow whole the legacy Beckett's brother had bled to build. Beckett said that the day he understood that was also the day something inside him died with his brother, that he had hunted the traitor down with his own hands until there was nowhere left to run, and had become the man he was today. A man who didn't allow himself to trust anyone, didn't allow himself to be soft, because he had learned at the highest price that trust was the knife, a person placed into the hand of the one who would kill him. Addie went still, and suddenly she understood everything, understood why he was so cold and ruthless, understood why he lived inside a loneliness so dense that even a small kindness from a stranger had been enough to make him stop in silence, understood why the leak and the betrayal waiting in the shadows had touched the deepest fear inside him, because he was living again through the very nightmare that had taken the only person he had ever loved. She didn't offer him empty comfort. She only placed her hand over the hand that was gripping the coin, a simple and trembling gesture, and said softly that her father had once taught her that keeping faith with another person wasn't weakness, but the bravest thing a human being could do, and that she believed there were still people in this world who wouldn't betray him, even if the world had taught him otherwise. Beckett looked down at the small hand resting over his, then lifted his eyes to hers, and in that moment, between the sound of the rain and the city lights blurred with water, two people, wounded in entirely different ways, suddenly realized they were standing closer to one another than they had ever allowed anyone else to come, and both of them knew, though neither said it aloud, that something had just changed forever. While Beckett and Hollis quietly tightened the circle around the traitor, one link no one had foreseen accidentally fell into the eye of the storm, and that link was Bryony Tate. To help her roommate, Bryony had taken a part-time job as a temporary data entry clerk for a small accounting services company downtown, the kind of low-paying work people hired for week by week, and no one bothered to run a background check for, and she had no idea that the obscure little company was actually one of the layers of shell operations Priscilla Vane's network used to move the dirty money being fed to Osgood Lane. One evening, while entering a series of invoices into the system, Bryony noticed something unusual. The numbers didn't match. Payments were being made to companies that didn't exist, and entries were being repeated in a strange pattern among a handful of rotating names. With the cautious nature of someone who worked with records, she took screenshots of a few screens so she could check them again later, not because she suspected anything terrible, but simply because she was afraid that if she had entered something wrong, her pay would be docked. She casually told Addie about it over dinner that night in their apartment in Pilsen, saying that the company she was working for seemed really strange. That money kept running in circles between meaningless names, and the instant Addie heard those words, she felt a chill run down her spine, because from her days working beside Beckett, she had accidentally heard enough to understand that this was exactly how hidden money streams operated. She tried to keep her voice calm as she told Bryony to delete those pictures and never mention them again, but it was already too late, because in the system of a network that survived on paranoid fear of betrayal, every unusual access left a trace, and the fact that a nameless temporary employee had opened the most sensitive entries again and again had triggered an alarm that went straight toward the kind of people who never left a threat unattended. The next morning, Addie brought that fear to Beckett, and as she told him what had happened, his face hardened in a way that made her understand Bryony had accidentally touched something even more dangerous than she had imagined. Hollis quickly confirmed that the images on Bryony's phone were direct evidence connecting Priscilla's money flow to Osgood Lane, the missing link Beckett had been hunting for weeks, but at the same time, they had turned Bryony, and through Bryony, Addie too, into targets for people willing to kill in order to silence someone. Beckett immediately ordered men to quietly protect the apartment in Pilsen and to back up all the data from Bryony's phone to a secure location, but he understood better than anyone that once the network had caught the scent of a leak, it wouldn't sit still, and time was no longer on his side. Addie looked at him in panic, realizing that her presence in Beckett's world had pulled her innocent friend into danger, and the fear she had carried for so long now turned into something very real and very close, no longer a vague sense of a dark world, but a specific threat hanging over the heads of the people she loved. Beckett took her hand, this time not to comfort her, but to make her look straight into his eyes, and said in a low, steady voice that he wouldn't let anything happen to her or to Bryony, that she had to trust him and do exactly as he told her. And Addie, though her heart was pounding with fear, nodded, not knowing that on the other side of the city, Priscilla Vane had just received word of the breach in her network and was smiling a cold smile because she had guessed exactly what that poor girl meant to the man she had once believed she had brought down. Priscilla Vane decided not to wait any longer, because in her mind, the breach that temporary employee had stumbled upon was a sign that time was running out, and if Beckett managed to trace the clue before she made her move, all the work she had poured into this for years would be swept away. That night, in the oak-paneled study of the Vane estate, she sat across from her father, Garrett Vane, a seasoned money-laundering kingpin with a face as cold as stone, and with them on a secure screen was Osgood Lane, the man who had been waiting for this moment for years. The three of them laid out a cold and complete plan, a coup calculated to unfold in a single night, taking advantage of what the entire underworld still believed, that the ghost of Greer Holdings was crippled, weakened, no longer strong enough to hold his empire together. Garrett would use his financial network to freeze Greer's key accounts that very night, cutting off the blood flow that kept the empire alive, while Osgood sent his men to seize the critical points, the harbors, the warehouses, the territories that for so long had remained untouchable because of the fear attached to Beckett's name. And Priscilla, with the position of fiancée she had worked so carefully to build, would be the one to step into the center of Beckett's power from the inside, using the access she had gained through his trust to throw open the final gate. She was certain she held the upper hand, because she still firmly believed the man in the wheelchair was a shadow of the man he had once been, and she had no idea that every move she made had been watched, that Beckett's legs had never truly been paralyzed, that the weakness she thought was his fatal flaw was actually the net she was crawling into on her own. As night deepened, the underworld began to tremble, calls were made, false loyalists turned one after another, and a series of Greer accounts were frozen exactly as planned, making it seem, for a few short hours to anyone looking in from the outside, as though the most powerful empire on the north side was collapsing before their eyes. At the glass tower, Hollis Frey rushed into Beckett's office, with wave after wave of news, one territory after another reporting attacks, one account after another locked down, one trusted hand after another now leaning toward the enemy, and anyone else in Beckett's position would surely have panicked. But Beckett Greer only stood silently by the window, rolling the silver coin across his knuckles in that slow, familiar rhythm, his face so still it was frightening, because every piece of bad news Hollis brought him wasn't a blow. It was one final piece falling exactly into place, a confirmation that the beast had stepped fully out of its den and exposed its entire shape beneath the light. He had spent weeks setting this net, had deliberately revealed false weaknesses, had quietly moved the assets that truly mattered to places Garrett's hands couldn't reach, and now, while his enemies celebrated their imagined victory, he held in his hands every name, every piece of evidence, every thread leading straight back to Priscilla, Garrett, and Osgood. He turned to Hollis and gave the order in a low, cold voice that it was time to close the net. But at that very moment, Addie's phone began ringing in the next room, and a terrible instinct struck when the voice on the other end wasn't Bryony's familiar one, but a thick silence, followed by the sweet and cruel voice of a woman, Priscilla's voice, saying she was holding something Beckett treasured very much, and that if he wanted it returned whole, he would have to come meet her himself. The truth of that night was more complicated than what the sweet voice on the phone revealed, because Priscilla's original plan had been to abduct Bryony Tate, the link who had touched the evidence, so she could silence her and recover the dangerous screenshots at the same time. Her men stormed the apartment in Pilsen, but thanks to the people Beckett had quietly placed on watch, Bryony had been taken somewhere else only a few minutes earlier, and that should have been a victory, if not for Addie, who, worried about her friend after being unable to reach her, returned to the apartment on her own in the middle of the worst confusion, and fell straight into the hands of men furious that their prey had slipped away. So instead of Bryony, Addie became the hostage in Priscilla's hands, and with the instincts of someone who always knew how to turn misfortune into advantage, Priscilla realized at once that this hostage was far more valuable, because this poor girl wasn't only a witness, but the one weakness the cold man had allowed to show in all these years. At the glass tower, Beckett listened to every word of Priscilla's threat, without letting even a thread of emotion enter his voice. But Hollis, who had stood beside him for 15 years, saw his hand close around the silver coin so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and understood that for the first time since his brother's death, his employer was truly afraid of losing something. In that moment, Beckett faced a choice that his whole life of cold calculation had never prepared him for, because he held in his hands everything he needed to destroy Priscilla, Garrett, and Osgood, every piece of evidence about the money flow, every recording of the treacherous conversations he had patiently gathered over the past several weeks, enough to hand their entire network over to federal authorities and wipe them out forever. But if he acted according to reason, if he closed the net at once like a wolf who knew only victory, Addie would be dead before he could reach Priscilla, and for the first time in his life, an absolute victory became something he couldn't accept. Certain she held the stronger hand, Priscilla set her terms. Beckett had to come alone to an abandoned warehouse by the river, bringing no men, calling no police, carrying all the evidence he had collected in exchange for the girl's life. And she added in a triumphant voice that she had always known a man's weakness didn't lie in his legs, but in his heart, and that she had found his heart. Beckett ended the call, stood motionless for a moment in the middle of the room, then turned to Hollis and began to speak, not in the voice of a desperate man, but in the voice of someone who had already calculated every step. Because even in this storm, the mind that had survived 15 years in the dark never stopped working. He understood that Priscilla wanted him to bring the evidence so she could destroy it, which meant she still didn't know that copies of everything had already been moved somewhere safe, and that was the advantage she had no idea he possessed. He told Hollis to prepare everything in a way Priscilla would never expect. Then he looked out at the rain veiling the night beyond the glass, toward somewhere across the city, where the girl who had poured him a glass of water, while the whole world laughed at him, was now bound in the hands of his enemy because of that very kindness, and inside the chest of the man who had once believed he had nothing left to lose, an emotion both cold-edged and burning rose up, not a hunger for power, but an absolute resolve that he wouldn't let history repeat itself, wouldn't stand by and watch another person he loved be stolen from him again. The warehouse by the river was cold and damp, its dull yellow light spilling down over stained concrete pillars, and in the middle of that space, Adeline Bennett was tied to an iron chair, her wrists aching sharply. But what frightened her even more than the pain was the cruel look in Priscilla Vane's eyes as she paced back and forth in front of her like a cat playing with its prey. When the large door screeched open, Beckett Greer appeared, still seated in the wheelchair, the briefcase Priscilla craved resting on his lap, and she smiled in triumph, ordering her men to search him, certain that this crippled and solitary man was now completely in the palm of her hand. When Addie saw him arrive, she burst into tears, shaking her head and telling him he shouldn't have come, that he shouldn't trade everything away for her. But in the very heart of that terror, when Priscilla leaned down and mockingly asked whether she regretted being foolish enough to show kindness to someone and bring disaster on herself, Addie lifted her head, her face soaked with tears but her voice not trembling at all, and said she didn't regret it, that if she had the chance to choose again, she would still kneel down and pick up that coin, still pour that glass of water, because she would rather die as a decent human being than live as someone who stepped over another person's pain. Those words cut through the room like a knife, and Beckett, who heard every syllable, felt something finally break open inside him. Not weakness, but a cold and sharpened resolve. And in the moment Priscilla turned to order the file destroyed, he did the one thing no one in the room had expected. He placed his hands on the arms of the chair and stood. The movement was slow but steady, the legs that had never truly been paralyzed, lifting his whole body upright. And the sight of Beckett Greer, standing tall, powerful, and fully intact, made the henchman freeze in horror while Priscilla stumbled one step back, her face twisting for the first time under the weight of a truth her mind couldn't process fast enough, that she had been deceived from the beginning, that the prey she had been hunting for all those months was in fact the hunter. In an instant, Beckett had closed the distance between them, one hand locking around her rising wrist, taking the gun from her and turning it back to control her, every motion decisive and cold, with the precision of a man who had never lost his ability to fight. And at that exact moment, according to the plan already set with Hollis, the warehouse doors burst open from every side. Hollis Frey led Beckett's men rushing in, disabling Priscilla's henchmen within a few short minutes with the discipline of professionals, and at the same time, from a distance, the sirens of federal vehicles began to echo, because Beckett had never truly come here alone. He had let Priscilla believe she was setting the rules of the game, while he was the one arranging the entire board, and copies of every piece of evidence were already in the hands of the people who would close the door on her fate. He handed the struggling and screaming Priscilla over to his men, then immediately turned to Addie, kneeling before the chair where she was bound, his hands, the same hands that had given orders over life and death, now trembling as they untied each knot, and when she was finally freed, she collapsed into his arms, both of them shaking in the freezing warehouse. Beckett, the man who hadn't cried since the night he lost his brother, pressed his forehead to her hair and whispered that he was sorry, that he had almost lost her, that he would never let anyone touch her again. Addie looked up at him through her tears, and in the dull yellow light of that dark place, amid the ruins of a conspiracy that had just collapsed, two people whom life had taught in very different ways that trust was a luxury finally found in each other, something that neither power nor poverty could ever buy or steal away. What happened after that night unfolded quickly and coldly, in the very way justice sometimes comes for those who believe they stand above everyone else, because the entire file of dirty money flows, the recordings of treacherous conversations, and the network of shell companies that Beckett had patiently gathered over many weeks were handed over in full to federal investigators, and within only a few days, the doors that had once stayed tightly closed around the Vane family were knocked on one after another. Priscilla Vane and her father, Garrett Vane, were indicted under organized crime and money laundering statutes, facing sentences that no fortune and no connection could buy their way out of, while Osgood Lane, the man who had waited his whole life to swallow Greer territory whole, suddenly found himself abandoned by his own allies in the shadows, completely isolated as his network shattered, and no one in the underworld dared stand beside a man who had lost. Delphine Kerr, the woman who had pointed her finger in a person's face and measured his value by the chair he sat in, never found a respectable job in that city again, because the disgrace of that night at Castellane followed her everywhere like a shadow she couldn't shake. And little by little, she came to understand, though far too late, that the cruelty people sow upon the powerless always finds its way back to them in the end. As for Beckett Greer, he didn't become a saint overnight, because the wounds and walls of 15 years couldn't disappear that easily. But something inside him had changed forever, and he began the slow and determined work of cleansing his empire, cutting away every dark branch, turning what had once been built on fear into things that could stand in the light. One restaurant, one building, one establishment at a time, slowly became a place where no human being would be judged by the clothes they wore or the burdens they carried, so that the place that had once humiliated a man in a wheelchair became the first place to learn again how to show respect. Addie's mother, Coralie Bennett, responded well to the treatments that were no longer a burden hanging over the two women's heads, and that spring, she was strong enough to brew a pot of tea with her own hands in the small kitchen filled with sunlight, with no more bills lying in the drawer like silent threats, no more nights when Addie lay awake in fear. And Addie and Beckett, two people who came from worlds separated by an entire abyss, chose to remain beside each other, not because she needed the shelter of power or because he needed the salvation of kindness, but because amid all the calculations and betrayals of life, they had found in each other the rarest thing of all, someone who saw who they truly were and still chose to stay. And that old silver coin, the thing that had once been the relic of a loss and a loneliness, Beckett gave to Addie on a quiet, windless afternoon, not as a gift but as a promise that the trust her father had once kept, the kindness she had given when she had nothing left, had not been crushed by this world after all, but had returned to save them both. And that is what this story wants to send to each of us, that the way we treat someone when we believe they have nothing to give us is the truest measure of who we are, that the kindness we give away, however small and meaningless it may seem, can sometimes become the seed that returns to change an entire life, and that a person's dignity never lies in the chair they sit in, the clothes they wear, or the money they have, but in the heart they carry. If this story has touched your heart in some way, please leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to be reminded that their kindness is precious, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can listen together to more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel, whether you have ever encountered an unexpected moment of kindness in your own life, or whether you have ever been the one to offer that kindness to a stranger. Please share the feelings from deep in your heart in the comments below, because every one of your stories is precious to us. Thank you for listening until this very moment, and may you, the person watching this video, always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.